Life and Teaching of Jesus and Mary by A.D.K. Look. Section 3. All the Wise Men and the Flight to Egypt. The Wise Men. Soon after they had gotten settled, the 3 wise men arrived in Jerusalem, inquiring after the newborn king, who had been expected for a long time, and was accepted to be the deliverer of Israel. The expectation of a Messiah coming was quite universal before Jesus' birth, not only with the Jews throughout the various lands they infiltrated and populated, but also with those of the Aryan race, especially with the Persians. Astrology, which led into many superstitions and various forms of black magic, was pretty widely accepted. They attributed both evil and good to it, to the influence of certain states and planets in various aspects and conjunctions. There was a general belief in the appearance of a star at the birth and death of great men, as well as such great events taking place at or around the time of a conjunction. There was a conjunction of 3 planets at the time of the birth of Jesus and also at the time of Gautama Buddha's birth. The belief was that the Messiah was to be King of Israel, who would be the representative and servant to carry out God's will. He was expected to be a political deliverer of the nation, who would restore Israel's former glories and rule over all lands. When the Messiah would be born, a star was to appear in the east. So when the wise men arrived in Jerusalem, stating they had seen the star, it was no wonder Herod got alarmed. As the signal of the star, Melchior, Caspar, and Balthazar started out on their journey to Jerusalem. These 3 wise men, kings, followed the star as it went before them. When they got to Jerusalem, they asked for the King of the Jews, who had recently been born, the Christ, as prophesied to be born in Bethlehem of Judea. Of Herod the Great, some historical writers say he was not a Jew, but through manipulation with Rome managed to acquire the position of king, and was thus on the throne at the courtesy of the Emperor of Rome. Although aged, he was still jealous and fearful of losing the throne. He ruled over Judea, Galilee, and other territory as well. Hence, upon hearing about the inquiry by the wise men, he called in some of the main priests and scribes to determine what had been prophesied as to where the Messiah was to be born. When he had that information, he sent for the Magi. This term or word for the priestly caste who had the higher knowledge has come down from Persia. Herod secretly got from them the time when they first saw the star. He sent them to Bethlehem to locate the Christ child and then report to him under pretense that he too was going to pay homage to the child. As they started on their way, the star went before them towards Bethlehem until it stood over the place where Jesus was and rested over the humble dwelling. There they found the child in Mary's arms. One story has it that after they entered, a ray of light from the star rested upon the infant's head. Mary has said she recognized them instantly as friends, as some ordained to play a role in the mission. The wise men paid homage to the child and presented their gifts. Melchior had brought myrrh, Caspar frankincense, and Balthazar gold. These gifts they left for the Christ child. Some relate these gifts with man's nature, gold representing man's material nature, frankincense the emotional, and myrrh the mental. The family used some of the gold during their flight to Egypt and also during their exile there. The myrrh and frankincense was saved for the end of his mission, a more sad occasion. The wise men had been warned, that is, had received promptings and instruction from a divine source not to return to Herod. So instead of returning by way of Jerusalem, they went back to their home countries by another route to avoid Herod. The three wise men were representative of the three phases of man's experiences: physical, feeling, and mental. With Jesus, this formed the square, the squaring of the circle, a cosmic action necessary for the work to be done on earth during this dispensation. Melchior was from India or Tibet. He is now known as the Ascended Master Moria. Caspar or Gaspar was from Mesopotamia, southern Persia. He is known as the Ascended Master Jawal Kul. Balthazar was from Ethiopia. He is now known as the Ascended Master Kuthumi. These three were responsible for bringing forth theosophy in the latter part of the 19th century before their ascension. Joseph and Mary were both very advanced life streams, completely devoted to God, and were used to have contact with divine beings from the higher realms. This by no means meant discarnates, disembodied spirits, or carnate entities, thought forms, that is, thought and feeling forms. Like Moses, it was through his contact with a great ascended master that opened the Red Sea and let his people pass over on dry ground to the other side. Moses was called upon to lead those people across the desert and wasteland. Then, with the Egyptian army behind, there was before him the Red Sea with no physical means of crossing. When his own reluctant people, whom he was trying to save, realized the predicament they were in, they released their curses upon him. There were thousands of them. Moses was a rather timid man, but had certain discipline and faith. He, his brother Aaron, and his sister Miriam had had training in the retreat at Luxor in preparation for the part they were to play in the Exodus. As he faced the seemingly impassable sea with his crowd of fearful and angry people, the God power within him commanded him to stretch forth his hand and part the water. He knew all would be lost if he became discouraged or resentful. He held his attention on the presence of God in faith, and through his call, the ascended being released the power which parted the sea. Thus, through divine power, they were saved, yet when he left them for a short time to be on Mount Sinai, they went back to worshipping idols. Much of the Hebrew law came from instructions received by early Israelites who had training in this retreat. Long before Moses went up Mount Sinai, much of the Mosaic law had been embedded in his consciousness. The being who appeared in the burning bush, which was not burnt, was the angel on whose forehead shone the word union. General Washington's vision. He is also known as Micah. He gave to Moses the statement, "I am that I am." He has been the guardian angel of the Jewish or fifth ray dispensation ever since. The 10 Commandments were given and written on tablets by a ray of light. Moses destroyed them because of bigotry, unbelief, defiance, and worship of idols by his people. When those tablets had been broken, the second time they were not produced by that way, and he had to chisel the letters of the words out of stone. It behooves all to comply with cosmic law. This is illustrated in Moses' case. When instruction or something is given by the divine to man, it is then up to man to preserve it, make right use of it, and give it to others, thus expand it. If that is not done, very often it is taken away, and he then has to get it the hard way. Unfortunately, with Moses, there were other forces, psychic forces, acting at times. These people wandered in the desert and in the wilderness, which represent human creation, wrong thoughts and feelings. They wandered for 40 years, whereas it was meant for them to master themselves in 7 years. At the end of 40 years, most of the original ones had passed on without attaining mastery. Moses himself did not attain his ascension then. He did not qualify on the point of happiness, which is his particular quality. In a later embodiment, he worked with and was very close to Gautama Buddha. He did make his ascension and is now known as the God of Happiness. Even though Moses, Aaron, Miriam, Jesus, and others took embodiment in the Jewish race, they really did not belong to that race. They had come to Earth as guardian spirits from other planets long before then, but took embodiment among these people to try to assist them. Flight to Egypt. Mary's early association with angels built a confidence and momentum which served her well years later, especially that particular night after the wise men's visit. She awakened in the night and saw Joseph standing in the doorway. Sensing he was troubled, she got up right away and went to him. He told her he had a warning, that they should leave the country immediately. Joseph questioned as to whether this came from the divine beings or whether it was from psychic forces. It did not seem possible to him that Jesus could be threatened with such cruelty so soon, when he had been born for such a great cause and victory. So Mary, wanting to be sure about it, suggested they get still and pray over it. They did, and Mary was soon aware that it was right and that it was the thing to do. They quickly gathered a few things and left that morning with the small but precious child. In this way, they escaped Herod's evil act. When the wise men did not return and report to Herod, he became enraged. Within a few days, he ordered all male infants up to 2 years of age in Bethlehem and the surrounding country slain. The infant's age of 2 years was calculated by Herod from the information received from the wise men. Their first sighting of the star might have been at the time of conception. The second appearance was at the time of Jesus' birth. It was after this that they started for Jerusalem. The journey took several months. This time added to the 9 months of gestation would make between 1 and 2 years. The family's flight to Egypt through wild country infested with animals was a long, tedious journey with sleepless nights. They came into a strange land where the people and their customs were so different. They had left behind them the soldiers of Herod who carried out his command by performing the merciless act of shedding the blood of those infants. Mary vowed then, as did Jesus later, that they would individually give assistance to the ascension to every one of those life streams, children, who lost their lives, that Jesus might live. According to one account, when Elizabeth heard of the order Herod had given concerning the infants, she took baby John and went out into the hills. She was familiar with the various caves and hid in one of them until danger was past. In the flight to Egypt, Mary and Joseph evidently had many interesting and unusual experiences. In her discourses, Mother Mary did not reveal whether the things recorded and which are claimed to have come down through the centuries are so or not. Her aim was to give unchronicled events and information, saying the other we already had. The Other Wise Man. Then there is the story of The Other Wise Man by Henry Van Dyke, given him in the Hall of Dreams, as he called it. It was evidently given to him at inner levels during sleep. It was about a fourth wise man. He likewise saw the star and started to follow it. His name was Artaban, from the mountain region of Persia. He was a follower of Zoroaster. He, as well as the 3 wise men, had calculated from the writings of the Hebrew Daniel and the ancient tablets of Chaldea the time, the year of this event, the birth of the Promised One. They studied the sky. They saw a new star which shone only one night. This story has it that the fourth wise man was going to meet the three at an appointed place where they saw the star again. Then they were to go to Jerusalem to worship the newborn king. It has been estimated that the trip required anywhere from 3 to 9 months by camel. Some other account has that the three wise men met in Jerusalem before Herod's palace, having come by 3 different routes and each entering a different gate, neither knowing about the other 2. Artaban sold his possessions and purchased 3 jewels, a pearl, a sapphire, and a ruby, to take as gifts. He told his fellow students and invited them to go with him, but they all declined. Then the star was seen again. This was at the time of Jesus' birth. Artaban started out alone. On the way he came upon a dying man. He was harassed at this delay, as there was barely time left to make his appointment. If he stayed to help this stranger, he would probably miss the others, but he might save the man's life. Should he risk the reward of his quest to render a charitable deed? Should he let anything interfere with his following the star? He gave a prayer and turned to help the man lying on the ground. Magi, of course, knew how to administer healing and were equipped for such service. After some hours, the man sat up, and Artaban told him he was a white magician of Ektabana, and that he was on his way to Jerusalem in search of the one born to be the Messiah, the deliverer of men. He gave healing herbs and whatever food he had to the man, told him that he could find shelter with the Hebrews of Babylon, which was nearby. The man prayed to God to bless and prosper his journey and said he had nothing to give him for the service rendered, but could tell him to seek for the Messiah in Bethlehem and not in Jerusalem. Artaban arrived at his destination at sunrise, but through his act of mercy, he had missed the caravan going across the desert. He sold the sapphire to equip himself for desert travel and started out. He arrived at Bethlehem after the 3 wise men had been there. The place seemed quite deserted. He was informed by a young woman rocking her baby, at whose house he stopped, that some strangers from the Far East had been in the village 3 days ago. They had been guided by a star, paid homage to the child, and disappeared. Also, that the family had fled that same night, presumably for Egypt. Since then, there seemed to be some evil in the atmosphere, and that Roman soldiers were being sent over. While he was there, the soldiers of Herod came down the street with swords. The cries of women were heard, exclaiming they were slaying their babies. Artaban stayed in the doorway and did not move at their approach. The soldiers were surprised at his posture and dress and hesitated. Then the captain made an attempt towards him. Artaban did not move, but held a steady gaze, holding him off for an instant. Then in a low voice spoke and said he was alone in the house, and he would give the ruby, displaying it, if he were left in peace. The captain took the gem and ordered the soldiers to march on, saying there was no child in the house. Artaban went back into the house. He prayed for forgiveness for having said a thing that was not so, to save a child. He had spent for man 2 of his gifts, which were meant for the service of God. Because of that, would he ever be worthy to see the king? The woman, shedding tears of joy because he saved the life of her child, asked the Lord bless and protect him and give him peace. Artaban continued his quest, his search for the Christ child. He went to Egypt in hope of finding some trace of the family from Bethlehem. Faint traces led him to Heliopolis, to the Nile and New Babylon, and also to the pyramids, the Sphinx, and Alexandria. Here he was informed by a rabbi, reading from the prophecies of Israel, that the king he was seeking would not be found in rich places, but among the poor and the oppressed. Thus he travelled on and on in search of them to worship the king. He found plenty who needed help. He assisted and healed many, which kept him so occupied that he nearly forgot his quest. He still had one of his 3 gifts, the pearl. Joseph and Mary started a new life, a new environment among alien people who were quite unfriendly and with little of worldly goods. Still, Mary held the peace through it all. Mary had developed the consciousness of holding the immaculate or divine concept through century after century of dedication and loyalty to God. To visualize or hold the immaculate concept is to see or hold in thought the divine pattern of the image and likeness of God, a God being. She could not relinquish this after Jesus' birth because in the infant and early stages of growth, his Christ self did not yet have enough control of the vehicle. So it was even more necessary to hold the guard because of his very sensitive mind and feelings. Mary's aura provided a spiritual sanctity as well as a protection for the baby Jesus before his outer consciousness remembered the Father. She carefully watched over him and at his first attempts to stand erect. He was always very erect from the time he started to walk. Jesus came into embodiment to represent and outpicture the nature of the God-parents who are known as Helios and Vesta. Jesus had studied them and their activities throughout the ages. He had absorbed much of their nature, so he was able to embody much of the nature of deity. This he brought through the veil of birth. Very early in life, he started at his mother's knee to externalize the action of the threefold flame in the heart, the Christ presence, as they called it then. In those early years, Mary held for Jesus the immaculate concept of his divine image and constantly cut away from his senses and his mind the remembrance of imperfection, turning him back to the image of the Father. Jesus was a very sensitive child. Mary started to teach him to magnify the Lord while a child at her knee. She taught him the phrase, "My soul does magnify the Lord," which she started to use when she was first reminded of his coming. She used it all the rest of her selfless life. When Jesus was young and sensitive in consciousness, and his senses would report imperfection to him, he would go to Mary, and, standing at her knee, together they would say, "Let us magnify the Lord," that is, draw forth the light of the God presence, magnify the good in any appearance that he had witnessed which might cause distress. He was taught that through his senses he could magnify either good or evil, that he could draw discord, destructive qualities, from the appearance world and magnify them, which would cause him to fail, or he could utilize these same senses and draw forth great light and attain mastery. This he did. Mary and Joseph taught him in very early life to withdraw the power from discord, to nullify it, and how to magnify only good and hold the immaculate concept. Within each one's soul is the magnifying power which increases either the good or evil. One's soul can magnify the appearances, or one can magnify the power of God within the heart. The practice of this greatly helped them through all the trials they encountered in life until the public ministry of Jesus began, which changed things for them. Joseph, Mary, and Jesus formed a trinity in their calling forth the power of God, in magnifying the law of life. This they did in all their requirements of daily life and also for their journey back to Palestine. The practice of the presence of God in all small things as well as the greater builds a momentum. Everything we do is done by the power of the presence, God, but we need to keep reminding the outer self of it until it is fully realized that this is the principle employed or operating through our bodies. In Egypt, they lived in a small dwelling place on the Nile River where Jesus liked to play. One morning, Mary went outside and noticed a huge crocodile close to him with his mouth wide open. Just for an instant she thought that might be the end of Jesus, but she did not permit fear to register within herself. Instead, she stood her ground, holding in her consciousness the divine protection for him. It appeared to her as if the crocodile actually smiled a big, broad grin. This relieved her, and she did not even call the boy back to safety, but she remained standing there, watching and holding the protection until the crocodile got back into the water and went away. Jesus just waved to her and went on playing. It was no accident that Jesus' parents settled on the capricious Nile near the temple of Luxor. While living there, Mary wove a basket in which Jesus could sit and float in the water along the bank while she told him the story of Moses and others of the Old Testament. Jesus learned much of the art of storytelling from his mother as he listened to her sweet voice relating the many tales. He also learned much from her about the elemental kingdom, as she had the power to enter into conscious communion with the elementals. They abode for a time near Karnak. When Jesus was old enough to understand some of the simpler workings of the law, they were bidden, divinely directed, to apply for entrance to the temple in the retreat there for training. He was about 3 years of age when his first instruction began. At that tender age, Mary would take the golden-haired child to the temple, clothed in a simple white tunic she had made and sandals Joseph had made for him. In the morning, when the brilliant sun kissed the waters of the Nile, she walked to the temple door, holding her son by the hand. The priest, who was his mentor, met them, unsmiling, bowed, gravely took the little one, took him by the hand and entered the temple. It seemed strange to Mary then, as a mother, to see so small a mite on so great a mission at such a tender age. But that entire life was a constant initiation between selfless renunciation upon her part and the natural mother love that wants to protect the seemingly helpless. Thus he had to leave the safe and comfortable aura of his mother. There he was aware of the heat of the sun on the sand, and in contrast the cold floors of the temple and the great vaulted ceilings. He could hear the chants of the Egyptian choirs. He learned those lessons which reminded him again of his spiritual source. Mary would wait outside the temple courts in the hot Egyptian sun until late afternoon, when the priests, holding the boy by the hand, would bring him to the gate, and Mary would claim him again. He always seemed so self-contained and so at home among all the robed priests and all the awesome splendour of the temple, and even his short white tunic already manifested a dignity that was not at variance with the vestments of the ordained priesthood. His training in that retreat was the same rigorous discipline that adults received and from which even some of them would shrink. The disciplines of the temple were not softened even though he was but a small child. Here, at the feet of the austere priest, he would begin to learn the control of energy, the control of aura, and sphere of influence. Here in the retreat before high priests who did not consider individuals, he learned the law of transubstantiation. One phase of training was that the pupils were given a flower without fragrance into which it was required they draw a particular fragrance. It had to be drawn to the point where someone in the group would acknowledge it. Thus, they passed the test. In such manner, Jesus learned the law. At times when he came out, there were circles under his eyes, and his forehead would be covered with perspiration. Although Mary's mother feeling was there, she did not interfere, but gave him full freedom. Her service was to hold that divine, immaculate concept, which gave him protection against fear and all imperfection, against the subtle actions of the destructive forces at inner levels. He deeply appreciated the love of his parents. It balanced the austerity, the discipline, and the great pressure required of one who applied for mastery in one of the temples at Luxor. As a small child, he was exposed to and felt the powerful radiation from the ascension flame in the Ascension Temple. He felt those vital currents surge through his inner bodies. The action of this ascension flame was to be fully utilized later in his life. He was to have its use years later to transmute the flesh and bones of his body. When attending the temple in Egypt, he submitted to the initiations and passed. He did not divulge any of the secrets of the retreat to his parents or anyone. He received illumination there, and Mary and Joseph were aware of it. From within his own consciousness, Jesus drew forth the remembrance of Lord Maitreya, who was his great teacher, guru, at inner levels before he took embodiment. The Master kept the child enfolded in his radiance from the time he was born, hoping sometime he would remember him. Jesus has said that his remembrance first began one day as he was lying in a field looking at the sun. Into his consciousness flashed the first glimmer of remembrance of Lord Maitreya and the connection of his outer self with the Father God. With his inner sight, the boy saw the shining face of Lord Maitreya, his teacher, and said, "Oh, Father, oh, Father." And back on the energy of that recognition came, "My son, my son." He did not give way to spiritual pride and told no one, not even his mother, but she observed and recognized the fact that it had occurred and that he had a visitation which awakened the Christ consciousness in his mind. Mary could see it in his eyes. She knew he would now join them in holding the concept, thus forming the Trinity. Jesus, Mary and Joseph represented the Trinity through which the mission of the Christ could be manifest. Jesus grew and waxed strong as he absorbed and manifested the dignity and mastery of Lord Maitreya. This even today represents the figure of the Christ. Very young, Jesus became aware of God within him. He was aware of an impelling force apart from his outer consciousness, which directed all his actions in a constructive manner. He has said of that day when he first saw Lord Maitreya in his consciousness and remembered that for this he was born, for this he came into the world. Oh, glory be to God in his mercy that he remembered before the time ran out, or there was yet breath in his nostrils, life in the loins, and he had strength, energy, the power of speech, and the capacity to make things right. While they dwelt in Egypt and Jesus was getting training in the retreat, although Mary, being a woman, was not permitted to attend, she received similar training in private. She was given the same instruction and trained in the powers of concentration by Serapis, who was in charge of the retreat. The main subjects of the instruction were on the suspension of the breath, the resurrection of the body, and the ascension. This was in preparation for the example Jesus was to manifest in the resurrection and then make a public ascension, for all mankind's blessings. The capricious river Nile would worry the villagers considerably by overflowing and destroying their crops and even sweeping away their abiding places. Mary made friends with the spirit of the Nile, who is a great elemental being. She conceded with it not to flood the flatlands, which had been taking place. So while they were there, the waters would inundate the fields enough that things would grow, but not flood and destroy their crops and homes. Every spring, Mary would silently commune with the spirit of the Nile and make a pact with it. She offered and agreed that if it would stay within the banks, she would in turn bless and help it, render a specific service to it through angel Devas, and raise its consciousness. This way, Mary governed that unusual spirit, and through that control the river overflowed only once, which was during the first year they were there. Through Mary's friendship with the spirit of the Nile, protection was given to all Egypt from many destructive activities of the elements. It is the aggregation of evil, wrongly qualified energy, miscreation by human beings, bad thought forms that cause storms, tornadoes, cyclones, earthquakes, and such activities. Mary instructed the child Jesus about the spirit of the Nile. This he loved very much. She called forth some small undines, elemental beings of the water element, from the river and put them in the palm of his hand. He could see them with his inner sight and study them. Then, after Jesus had passed his training in the temple, in the retreat, Mary told him they were going to meet the great spirit of the Nile. She taught him how to contact that spirit. Here, Jesus learned things which he used later during his ministry to illustrate the power of God. While in Egypt, Joseph and Mary had many severe experiences which tested their faith and power of concentration, even more than at home, where Jesus was born. They stayed in Egypt for some years. Then they heard Herod had passed on, so they returned to Jerusalem and Bethlehem. Things had quieted down for the time being. They were not sure they should settle in Judea, as Herod's son Archelaus was now ruler of Judea. Herod Antipas, another son of the former king, was ruler over Galilee. He was less severe than his brother. After their arrival, an angel appeared to Joseph and told him to go to Nazareth to live. This was in order to fulfill the prophecy, since it had been prophesied that the Messiah would be a Nazarene. And so they went to Nazareth, the small hometown of Mary. During Jesus' growing years there, they enjoyed their lives together. Joseph embodied the qualities of the Heavenly Father whose will Jesus was to express on earth. Jesus has said that as a child, Joseph's love, kindness, care, solicitude, grace and wisdom and beautiful personage reflected to him and brought to his outer consciousness the remembrance of the Father God. Joseph represented the outer pattern of the Father of Light, that Jesus might out-picture his graciousness until he had matured enough to recall his mission. Joseph and Mary lived in Galilee seemingly no different from the many others there, yet they held the consciousness and vision of their innocent son grown into a Christ man. Jesus was fortunate indeed for the spiritual strength of his parents, their acceptance of the angelic beings, their ability to withstand the ridicule of that generation, and their sincere devotion to God. Mary's thoughts and feelings were constantly and consciously concentrated on holding the immaculate concept for Jesus against the appearances of the outer world, cutting away imperfections. Thus she helped him magnify the image of the Father God, which he was to outpicture through the physical form, and become a Christian man. Archangel Gabriel helped Mary hold the immaculate concept for Jesus and to refrain from accepting any human appearances. Gabriel and the other archangels assisted her and Joseph in the many trying experiences which they had to pass through. They had to use all the intuitive powers that they had developed. All during Jesus' life, the archangels and lesser angels were his companions, his mother herself coming from that kingdom. Jesus had the ability to cognize the presence of the angels as Mary did also. Thus, he was sustained by the feelings of these beings and the proximity of his mother in the times of his greatest trials, so that he did not falter upon the path. Their light and love upheld him, and he successfully passed through every test. Mary's knowledge and the acceptance of the angelic beings greatly helped Jesus to accept them as real, tangible beings. Joseph's awareness of them also helped. Thus, Jesus had constant association with and protection from them all his life, without which he could not have fulfilled his mission. Their light formed a wall of protection around him, preventing the viciousness and destructive vibration from entering his world. This enabled him to hold connection with the Father, his God Presence, Lord Maitreya, and other divine beings. Mary, Joseph and Jesus were attuned to the angelic host and cooperated with their own ministering angels. One of these angels is assigned to each life stream and remains through all embodiments, yet mankind is wholly unaware of them. In general, mankind is skeptical, doubtful, and unbelieving of the reality of the angelic host. Through the centuries, this has built a wall between them. It is necessary of humanity to again become aware of the angelic kingdom and divine beings to fully bring in the new age we are entering. Many people, when they begin to have some spiritual or inner experiences, want to be telling everyone. This is spiritual pride. Instead of telling, they ought to ponder over it, develop, and utilize it. Mary passed through that test too. When Archangel Gabriel came and conveyed to her the truth that her baby would be the Messiah, it was required of her to tell no man, to ponder on it and keep it in her heart. Even after birth, she dared not reveal who he was. Not even to the priests of the temple could she say in confidence to be careful of such a sacred and beautiful child. During his growing years, she and Joseph often talked about this as he played, but they told no one. One cannot achieve a great mission without assistance from ascended beings, the angelic kingdom, and individuals in embodiment who volunteer their help. Even Jesus needed that assistance, although he came into that embodiment without sin, bad karma. To be born without sin, like he was, means that one has transmuted and cleared his life stream of all destructive karma of previous embodiments through application before taking that embodiment. To be thus born is not grace granted because one is going to render an extraordinary spiritual task, but he had earned the privilege for such opportunity. Jesus had the great protection and assistance of Mary and Joseph. Still, it was not easy. He has said it took all his strength and divine power he could draw forth to hold his consciousness from accepting the human appearances while living in this world where disease, illness, poverty, and death abounded. Had he accepted appearances, these would have distorted his inner bodies and then the physical body too. Since our senses have been provided to record, they record distress as well as the good. After the laggards were allowed to embody on earth, this is how the ones then pure in soul were first lured from the Garden of Eden, from their pure and harmonious state of consciousness. Jesus came with a natural purity of consciousness. He had attained a high state of consciousness previously. Therefore, his thoughts and feelings were clear and pure. His mental and emotional bodies were pure, and the remembrance of Helios, Vesta, and Lord Maitreya throbbed in his etheric body. He had perfect sight and hearing, and all his senses were highly developed. He was very intuitive and very sensitive to spiritual things. He was much more aware of spiritual, inner things than the average person, and much more sensitive to outer world vibrations. Thus, he would be capable of drawing into himself the distress of the appearance world with greater impact. He lived in the world of human appearances with the five senses, and through free will could have created karma by misqualifying energy. Such has happened before and since Jesus' time. As a result, the individual's mission was not accomplished, nor did he make ascension. Mary understood this and realized he needed very great protection while he grew up. Therefore, she gave him special training from babyhood and taught him early in life how to magnify the Lord. Jesus, even when very small, had a great love of life. He would bring to Mary bruised flowers or an injured bird, and through love endeavour to restore it. Lord Maitreya had suggested to the parents that they start in early childhood to draw the action of the resurrection flame. This they did together in the garden by drawing the flame through the grass and through flowers, restoring petals and bringing perfume into them again. Also restoring the wing of an injured bird he had brought home so it could fly again. Jesus would rejoice at seeing these things. Then, when he was older and could comprehend the activity, Mary would tell him to let the Christ in him do it, restore it. Like other children, he would come home with bruises on his arms, hands, knees, or legs. Mary would say to him that they were not going to magnify the injury, but instead were going to magnify the Lord. They made a game of it. Mary with him, and Joseph too, whenever he was there, would turn their attention to the perfect pattern, see that spot made perfect, and draw healing and peace from the God presence through their bodies until it was perfect and the appearance of imperfection had disappeared. They did it systematically, and that way gained a momentum which built a power in his consciousness that would resist the appearance of all evil. This was a preparation for the time when he was crucified, and then he had the power to refuse to accept. Then he had the power to refuse to accept or magnify even death. Instead, he turned all the energy of his life to magnifying the power of his light and life through him until death vanished. In his growing years, Mary said to Jesus to let the Christ in him expand and serve God, to let the Christ through him minister to all that lives. The receptive boy would raise his little hands, allowing expansion of the silver cord into his heart, thus allowing the Christ to expand every time she said it. So it grew, at first being nourished by his acceptance of her feeling of it, until he was of an age when it took charge. by the constancy of her endeavour to develop the Christ and allow it to expand through him, gave him faith in the power that Christ, through him, could do everything. Back in Nazareth, after those initiations at Luxor, they began the activity of conscious magnetization and radiation which Mary taught him as a child. He began daily to consciously magnetize the nature of the Father God and to radiate that out, which was a blessing to the people there. They now used it directly to benefit their fellow man, but they never spoke of it to anyone. They kept it to themselves, except as it was manifest. The people knew of it only through sensing the peace, faith, illumination, harmony, and healings of various kinds, which they came to get. The great ones endowed Jesus with the power of the sacred fire, and the threefold flame in his heart had greatly expanded. The threefold flame being also in the hearts of the others, so that when the action of his flame and power connected with their flame, it set up whatever activity was required. People accepted the personal Jesus as doing these things. Jesus learned to draw the power of divine love, also the power of magnetizing from the angelic host as his brain consciousness grew in a capacity to remember and to act through the physical body. His parents, being familiar with the angelic host, were therefore very good teachers for him. They would magnetize various activities of the sacred fire and then radiate that out into rivers, the sea, and various activities of nature. They did not live a charmed life, but in a small village in humble quarters in an ordinary house at that time. People look back at the glamour and magnificent pageantry of the early Christian movement, which has taken on an unreal aspect. Yet they were people like ordinary people nowadays. They walked the dusty roads, protected themselves as best they could from the elements, refreshed themselves at a cool well. They moved among the distress of mankind, the sick, diseased, crippled, blind, and leprous, from which the Western world is protected. There were no institutions as now, whose walls kept these hidden from view. Among such conditions, Mary and Joseph had to raise Jesus. Thus, he was exposed to all kinds of vibrations, to thoughts and feelings of every kind from others, on every plane. The only protection he had from these was the love from Mary and Joseph. They endeavoured to keep him from contacting any type of discord that could register in the sensitive vibratory action of his consciousness. They knew if it did, and his feelings connected with it, he would outpicture as a soiled part. It would outpicture as a soiled part, an imperfection, but he had to remain immaculate in order to draw the cosmic currents when his ministry began. Although we are not subjected now to such things and conditions as Jesus was, we should attain complete control over ourselves as he did and attain mastery which he exemplified. We should control and become master over all substance, energy and vibration which flows through us or that we contact, and consciously have mastery over substance, form, and appearance. This does not mean that we should become hardened and have no feeling, quite the contrary, but instead become compassionate. Instead of sympathizing, which is agreeing with the imperfection, thus accepting it in one's feelings, thereby becoming one with it, we should recognize, see, and feel the God presence which is and remain perfect. See and feel the God presence which is and remains perfect, regardless of what happens out here. Thus, we do not amplify it by adding energy to the wrong conditions, but when we give recognition to the God presence, this gives the presence the authority to act down here in this realm in which we are the authority. There in Nazareth, they began the Magnificat, magnifying the powers of the Christ God. When Jesus would come home after wandering through the village, having seen some who were ill or in distress, or he encountered some unkindness, he would wonder about these things and sometimes speak of them. Mary would explain that those appearances were only temporary, that those individuals were also children of God who had for a time fallen from grace, and that they would magnify the Lord in them. The three of them would do so together. Mary taught Jesus that he had the power within him, through thought and feeling, to magnify anything that he chose to accept as real, that he could magnify perfection, the Lord of life, the good, the divine qualities within him instead of accepting discordant human qualities. To magnify the Lord instead of discordant appearances helped not only Jesus so much throughout his life, but it helped Mary too. She has said the application of that principle helped her greatly in the trials and initiations she had to go through in that embodiment, and even saved her sanity at times. She had initiations to go through which no one on earth now needs go through. Thus, Mary was privileged to help Jesus to use his faculties to magnify the perfection of the Father God, the God power which he had come to represent and outpicture to humanity. In this way, Jesus learned lessons, many things which he used later in his ministry to illustrate the divine power. The principle is that anyone, no matter whether he's a student or not, does magnify either good or evil. Everyone's soul, the action of thought and feeling, is a magnet and does magnify whatever one's attention connects with. From the soul flows one's life. That is, his life flows from his heartbeat through his soul into whatever his attention is on and magnifies it. One's life flows on his attention to whatever appearance his attention connects with. This way, one feeds his life into it, which makes it grow. Thus it is magnified in one's consciousness in both the appearance world and at inner levels. To magnify the Lord, instead of imperfection, is done by turning the attention to and holding it on the Christ self. Thus, the beam of one's energy flows to it, magnifying the divine power and qualities. It is through the use of this principle that Jesus performed so-called miracles in later life. This is principle that can be applied by anyone. It is a mathematical and scientific principle which no one escapes. We can magnify either the appearances, things of the outer world, or we can put our attention on the Christ self and magnify the divine power. When they got back to Galilee, because of what Mary had taught Jesus, he made friends with that turbulent spirit of the Sea of Galilee. This was to such an extent that later the angry tossings of the sea were stilled at Jesus' word. Now came the time during his growing years when they fulfilled the things according to the letter of the Scripture. Jesus attended the temple and gave obedience to the letter of the law, and thus he became the prince of the house of David. Joseph, Mary, and Jesus went to Jerusalem for the annual feast of the Passover, as was the custom with the religious people there. At the time when Jesus was 12 years of age, They again went as usual. After the festivities, they started back home in a caravan made up of relatives and friends. Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents were unaware of it, thinking he was among those in the caravan. After a day's travel, it occurred to them to look for him. Searching through the caravan, they did not find him, so they returned to Jerusalem. It took them 3 days to locate him. They found him in the temple with teachers, rabbis, doctors, elders, and learned men of Israel, to whom he was listening and asking them profound questions. These men were astonished at the type of questions he asked, as well as his answers, understanding, and wisdom. He explained many things to them about physics, metaphysics, the law of cause and effect, the creative faculties, the operation of the soul, the creation of the body and dissolution, the powers of nature and divine powers. All this was beyond their understanding. These things he had learned in his retreat training, but these so-called men knew nothing of such places. While still talking on these things, Mary and Joseph came. After all their searching, they were somewhat amazed to find him in such a group of men. When Mary asked Jesus why he had done such a thing to them, they being anxious about him, he replied by asking why they sought him, that they ought to know he should be about his Father's business. Then the men wanted to know if the boy was her son. Mary told them that he was, and they thought how wonderful to have such a son. Jesus went back to Nazareth in obedience to his parents. His life now became more seclusive and secret until his public mission began.